The Clockmaker Who Predicted Every Murder, a Sherlock Holmes mystery. Chapter 1. A Disc of Brass and Dread. It was a raw morning in November, the fog lying thick along Baker Street like a shroud that London itself could not shrug off, when Inspector Lestrade arrived at our lodgings in a state I had rarely seen him display. He was not a man given to drama. His profession had long since worn the capacity for astonishment out of him through 20 years of murders, forgeries, and the lesser, grubbier crimes that make up the daily bread of Scotland Yard. Yet as he stood dripping upon our hearthrug that morning, turning his hat round and round in his hands with the restless motion of a man who does not trust his own fingers to be still, I saw in his sharp little eyes something close to fear, and I confess the sight of it chilled me rather more than the weather had. Mrs. Hudson had shown him up without ceremony, as she generally did with policemen, who she regarded as a species of tradesman entitled to no particular deference, and he had taken up his stand before the fire, as though its warmth might dispel whatever had unsettled him, though I observed that he did not so much as glance into the flames. "Mr. Holmes," said he, "I have seen many strange things in 20 years at the Yard, but never anything to match this." Holmes, who had been engaged in some delicate chemical analysis at the side table, surrounded by his usual litter of retorts and test tubes, and the faint, acrid smell of some reagent I could not identify, did not so much as glance up. "You have come about the Renfield matter," he said, in the flat, almost bored tone he reserved for observations he considered entirely beneath remark. Lestrade's hat stopped turning mid-revolution. "How the deuce? I have not breathed a word of it to a living soul outside the department. You have breathed a great deal of it onto the front page of the Morning Sphere, which I observe protruding from your coat pocket, folded to the third column, where I perceive the headline, 'Clockmaker Found Slain in Clerkenwell Workshop.' The rest required no great feat of intellect, Lestrade, only the ability to read upside down, which I confess I cultivated some years ago as a useful accomplishment, along with the rather less reputable art of reading a man's recent history in the condition of his boots. Yours, I observe, have carried you through the mud of Clerkenwell within the last hour, and not merely to your breakfast." I could not suppress a smile, though Lestrade looked rather put out, glancing down at his boots with an expression of mild betrayal, as though they had conspired against him. He drew the newspaper from his pocket nonetheless and laid it upon the table, along with a small leather case bound in brass that he produced from within his coat, with the careful, almost reverent motion of a man handling something he did not entirely trust. "It is not the murder itself that brings me here, gentlemen, baffling as it is in its own right. It is this." He opened the case and produced a small brass disc, no larger than a shilling piece, engraved upon its face with the image of a clock, hands frozen at 11 minutes past 9, and beneath it, in minute copperplate lettering so fine that I was obliged to lean close to make it out at all, a verse, "When the hour strikes its second turn, the watchmaker's own fire shall burn. S.W. 11 past the 9th hour. "This," said Lestrade, his voice dropping as though the very walls might overhear, and carry the tale further than he wished, "was delivered to the offices of the Sphere 4 days before Silas Renfield was found dead in his workshop in Clerkenwell. Strangled, Mr. Holmes, with a length of clock chain, at exactly 11 minutes past 9 in the evening, precisely as that wretched thing predicted. To the very minute, mark you, not a moment either side of it." The editor thought it some crank's jest and very nearly printed it as a curiosity for his Saturday Miscellany column. He did not, thank God, or all London would now be screaming witchcraft from every public house between here and Whitechapel, and the Yard would have a panic on its hands to match the murder itself. Holmes set down his test tube at last and took up the disc, turning it beneath the lamp with the slow, deliberate attention he reserved for objects of genuine interest, an attention I had learned, over the years of our association, to distinguish readily from the polite indifference with which he greeted the merely curious. "A prophecy fulfilled to the minute," he murmured, half to himself. How delightfully impossible. Pray, Lestrade, sit down. You are dripping upon Mrs. Hudson's rug, and will earn us both a scolding. And tell me who is Silas Renfield, and why should anyone trouble to announce his murder a full 4 days in advance? It argues a confidence I find almost as remarkable as the crime itself. Renfield was master of the Worshipful Company of Chronometer Makers, one of the finest horologists in England. By all accounts, a man whose clocks hang in half the cathedrals of the kingdom, and whose name was spoken of with something close to reverence by every clockmaker from here to Edinburgh. A widower these 11 years, lived alone above his workshop in Clerkenwell with only his niece, a Miss Helena Quill, who acted as his assistant and kept his books with what I am told was considerable skill. No enemies that anyone can name, no debts, no scandal of any kind. A respectable, rather solitary old gentleman who built clocks for half the great institutions of the country, and who by every account I have gathered was as harmless and as dull a man as ever drew breath. And the chain that killed him, from his own workshop, taken down from a hook where it had hung, I am told for years, awaiting some repair he had never got round to. No struggle to speak of, the furniture scarcely disturbed. He seems to have admitted his killer willingly, or else been taken entirely by surprise from behind, for there was no sign that he had so much as risen fully from his chair before the chain closed about his throat. And the disc, how was it delivered? By post, addressed in block capitals to the editor personally, postmarked Clerkenwell 2 days before. No finger marks of any use, no signature, nothing whatever to trace it by save the postmark itself, which tells us only what we already knew, that whoever sent it walked the same streets as the man he meant to kill. Holmes rose and went to the window, where the fog pressed grey and formless against the glass, blotting out the houses opposite so completely that we might have been suspended in some void entirely without geography, and stood a long moment in silence, his hands clasped behind his back, his head bowed, in that attitude of concentration I had come to recognize as the prelude to some great unfolding of thought. When he spoke again, it was in that low, rapid murmur he used when his mind had already outpaced his words, and was obliged to wait, with visible impatience, for his tongue to catch up. A murder predicted to the very minute, Watson, and a victim wholly without enemies, by Lestrade's own account. Either we are dealing with the supernatural, which I decline on principle to entertain before breakfast, and indeed at any hour of the day, or we are dealing with a mind of such cold and patient calculation that the very impossibility of the thing is itself the chief clue to its solution. A man does not commit himself to a public prophecy of murder unless he is entirely certain of his own ability to fulfill it, and such certainty, Lestrade, is purchased only by long and careful study. He turned back to the inspector. Has there been any other communication? Any second disc, any further word from this prophet of brass and copperplate? Lestrade hesitated, and in that hesitation I read the true reason for his visit, the fear that had driven him through the fog to our door at so early an hour. Not yet, he said at last, but I confess, Mr. Holmes, I have a dreadful suspicion there will be, and I should rest a good deal easier if you would consent to look into the matter before that suspicion is confirmed. As do I, said Holmes quietly, and there was nothing in his tone of the dry irony with which he generally greeted Lestrade's appeals for assistance. Watson, be so good as to fetch my hat and the heavier of my 2 coats. The fog will not have lifted by Clerkenwell, and I should rather not catch a chill in the pursuit of a murderer, who has, I think, very little intention of catching cold himself. We are going to Clerkenwell, Lestrade, and I beg you will say nothing further upon the subject until we have seen the ground for ourselves. Theories formed before evidence are seldom worth the breath spent upon them. Chapter 2. The Watchmaker's Riddle. The hansom rattled eastward through streets grown narrower and grimmer as we left the fashionable quarters behind. The fog, thinning by degrees to a yellowish murk, through which the gas lamps burned with that peculiar, smeared brilliance, London reserves for its dirtiest mornings, and Holmes settled into the corner of the cab with his chin upon his chest and his hat drawn low over his eyes, said nothing for the better part of the journey. I had long since learned not to disturb him in such moods, though I confess my curiosity burned fiercely enough to make the silence a trial, and I occupied myself instead in watching the city change its character about us, the broad, well-swept thoroughfares giving way to narrower courts hung with washing, the prosperous shop-fronts to the cramped, soot-darkened windows of 100 small trades. It was only as we crossed into Clerkenwell proper, that ancient warren of narrow courts and workshops where, for 2 centuries, half the clocks and watches of England had been born beneath grimy skylights, where the very air seemed to carry the faint, ceaseless ticking of 1,000 unseen mechanisms, that Holmes at last stirred himself, sitting upright with the sudden, restored vigour of a man who has finished some lengthy calculation to his own satisfaction. You will have noticed, Watson, the gentleman who boarded our train of thought, so to speak, the moment Lestrade entered our rooms. I noticed only that you deduced he had come about the Renfield case before he said a word, which struck me, I confess, as scarcely less remarkable than the prophecy itself. A trifle, and not one I should trouble you with again, were the matter not instructive. But consider the disc itself, Watson, and set aside for the moment the question of how the murder was foretold, which is a puzzle for Lestrade's superstitious constables, rather than for men of reason. Consider only its manufacture, a riddle in verse, a clock face, the victim's initials, the precise hour, engraved, mark you, not written, not printed, not scrawled in the haste of malice. Engraving requires tools, requires skill, requires above all time, and a steadiness of hand that anger does not generally permit. This was not dashed off in a fit of inspiration, however malicious. It was crafted with the same patience a man might bring to the building of a watch movement, each tooth of each wheel filed to its precise dimension before ever the whole is assembled. You think the murderer is a clockmaker himself. I think it probable that the murderer possesses a clockmaker's hands, or has access to a clockmaker's tools, or, and this interests me rather more than either possibility, has spent his life among such men and absorbed their habits of mind without ever quite becoming one of their number, as a child raised among soldiers absorbs the rhythms of the drill without ever himself bearing arms. There is a difference, Watson, between a man who makes clocks and a man who is made by them, shaped, I mean, by years of measuring his existence in minutes and seconds until the measuring itself becomes a kind of creed. Such a man does not merely tell time, he worships it or hates it, or both at once, which I begin to suspect is the more common condition, and the more dangerous one. I confess I found this distinction subtler than I could readily grasp, and said so, somewhat ruefully, for I had grown accustomed over the years to confessing my own slower comprehension without undue embarrassment. You will grasp it before the week is out, said Holmes, with the faint, irritating smile of a man who already sees the end of the path while his companion still gropes at its beginning, and I dare say you will wish by then that you had not. Now, observe, for we are arrived, and observation is a faculty that improves only with constant and immediate exercise. We had drawn up before a narrow building of soot-blackened brick, its ground floor given over to a workshop window in which a dozen clocks of every description, long case and bracket, French ormolu and plain English oak, ship's chronometers and delicate ladies' watches laid open upon velvet, ticked, chimed and gonged in cheerful disharmony, as though entirely indifferent to the tragedy that had occurred above them, the great wheel of mechanical time turning on regardless of the small human catastrophe it had somehow been made to measure. A constable stood at the door, stamping his feet against the cold, and beyond him, pale and composed in dark mourning, stood a young woman whom I took at once for Miss Helena Quill, though nothing in Lestrade's description had prepared me for the steadiness with which she regarded our approach. She was perhaps 26, with dark hair drawn back severely beneath a black bonnet, and a face that might have been called plain were it not for a pair of remarkably steady grey eyes. eyes that regarded Holmes now with an intensity I should not have expected from a woman so recently and so violently bereaved, an intensity that spoke less of grief, I thought, than of some fierce and urgent purpose she had not yet found occasion to voice. "Mr. Holmes," she said, before Lestrade could so much as perform an introduction, her voice low but perfectly controlled. "I had hoped you would come. I read of your methods 2 years ago in connection with the Hartsdown forgeries, and I have hoped ever since that I might never require your assistance, for I understood even then that no one calls upon you save in the very deepest extremity. I do not believe the man who killed my uncle is who the police suppose him to be, Mr. Holmes, and I have been waiting 4 days for someone willing to listen to that belief, rather than dismiss it as a niece's natural reluctance to think ill of an old family quarrel." Holmes's eyebrows rose a fraction, and I saw him take her measure in a single swift glance, the steadiness of her hands, the absence of any handkerchief twisted in distress, the directness of her gaze, before he answered, "And who do the police suppose him to be, Miss Quill?" "Mr. Aldous Vane," she said, "my uncle's oldest rival within the guild, and, as everyone in the company will gladly tell you, for they have told me often enough these 4 days, his oldest enemy besides, a quarrel of 30 years standing over matters of governance and precedence that has outlasted every other concern either man ever held. And you do not believe it?" "I do not believe it," she said, with the first flicker of feeling I had yet seen cross her composed features, "because the truth, Mr. Holmes, is very much stranger than that, and very much more frightening, and I confess, I have not slept soundly since the night I found him." Chapter 3. Footprints in Renfield's Workshop. Miss Quill led us up a narrow staircase that smelled of beeswax and machine oil, and, faintly beneath both, the cold, clean scent of brass, past walls hung with clock faces of every era, ornate French mantelpieces gilded and enamelled, severe Puritan lantern clocks black with age, the brass innards of half-finished chronometers, laid open like surgical specimens upon shelves of dark oak, until we came to a small chamber at the rear of the first floor, lit by a single gas jet turned low, where the murder had occurred, and where, I sensed the moment we crossed the threshold, something of the violence done there yet lingered in the very air. The room had been left, at Holmes's earlier insistence relayed through Lestrade by telegram, exactly as it was found, save for the removal of the body itself, and I confess the chamber struck me as oddly peaceful for all that had happened within it. A workman's sanctuary, orderly and quiet, now disturbed only by the small, terrible alteration of a single overturned table. A workbench ran along one wall, littered with tools, gears, half-wound springs coiled like tiny serpents, and the skeletal frame of an unfinished long-case clock standing sentinel in the corner, its pendulum motionless, its hands frozen at some hour that meant nothing now. A heavy armchair stood by the cold grate, worn smooth at the arms by years of use, and it was here, Lestrade explained in a hushed voice quite unlike his usual brisk officialdom, that Renfield had been discovered, the clock chain wound twice about his throat, his hands still clutching at the air, the coroner had noted, as though even in death he sought to wind back the moments that had been stolen from him. Holmes knelt by the chair without a word and remained motionless for what felt to me a considerable time, his lean form perfectly still save for the occasional turn of his head, his eyes moving with that swift, methodical thoroughness that took in everything and dismissed nothing until its significance, or its insignificance, had been properly weighed. He examined the carpet, running his fingers along its nap against the grain, the chair's arms, where he paused longest of all, the position of a small reading table that had been overturned, its contents, a pipe, a pair of spectacles, a half-finished glass of port, scattered but unbroken, and finally the window, which looked out upon a narrow yard, hemmed in by the blank brick backs of neighbouring houses. "The window was found as it is now?" he asked, without turning. "Latched from within," said Lestrade. "We made certain of that at once, Mr. Holmes, knowing you would ask, And the door? Unforced. And indeed Miss Quill informs us it is rarely locked at all of an evening, the workshop being thought secure enough by its situation. I was at the theatre, Helena Quill said quietly. From the doorway, her arms folded as though against a cold that had nothing to do with the temperature of the room. My uncle insisted I go. He said he expected no one, and wished an evening of quiet to finish his accounts, which had fallen somewhat behind, owing to a matter I will explain to you presently, if you wish it. I returned a little after 11 and found him as you saw, rather, before they took him away, and I do not think, gentlemen, that I shall ever again hear a clock strike 11 without recalling that hour. Holmes rose and crossed to the workbench, where his attention fixed at once upon a small brass tray containing engraving tools, gravers of various widths, burins, a tiny vice no larger than a thumb, all arranged with the meticulous order of a man who could not abide disorder even in the smallest particulars of his craft. Your uncle did his own engraving? Always. He took great pride in it, Mr. Holmes, greater pride, I sometimes thought, than in the mechanisms themselves, though he would never have admitted as much. He used to say a clockmaker, who could not engrave his own dials, was no true craftsman at all, merely an assembler of parts another man had perfected, and he held that distinction with a severity that cost him friendships, I am sorry to say, among lesser craftsmen who felt the judgment keenly. Indeed! Holmes lifted one of the gravers and held it to the light, turning it slowly between his fingers, then produced from his pocket the brass disc Lestrade had brought to Baker Street, comparing the two with the close attention of a jeweller appraising a stone of uncertain provenance. Watson, your glass, if you please. I handed him my pocket lens, and he bent low over both objects for a long moment. His breath held, it seemed to me, quite without his own awareness of the fact, before straightening with an expression I had come to recognize, not triumph precisely, but the quiet satisfaction of a man who has confirmed a suspicion rather than discovered a fact entirely new to him. The engraving upon this disc was not done with any tool upon this bench, he said at last, with the flat certainty of a man stating an established fact rather than venturing an opinion. The stroke is narrower, the angle steeper, the depth more uniform than even the finest of these gravers could readily produce. Whoever cut that verse used a graver ground to a finer point than any here, a point favoured, if my memory of horological practice serves, by men who engrave not dials but ledger plates and small metal labels for filing systems, account books, Lestrade, not clock faces. The distinction may seem a small one, but I assure you it is not. A bookkeeper, then, not a craftsman, or a craftsman who has spent more recent years as a bookkeeper than as a craftsman, said Holmes, his eyes narrowing towards some inward calculation he did not yet share with us, though I could see the machinery of his thought already turning behind that narrowed gaze. Tell me, Miss Quill, does the Guild of Chronometer Makers maintain any sort of central record office, a place where the personal affairs of its members might be kept on file, with the sort of patient, methodical attention your uncle plainly valued so highly? Something flickered across her composed features, surprise, I thought, or perhaps something nearer apprehension, quickly suppressed. Why, yes, she said slowly, as though reluctant to follow the thread Holmes had laid before her, sensing perhaps where it must lead. The Benevolent Fund Archive at Chronometer Hall. Every member's circumstances are recorded there in considerable detail. Health, habits, household arrangements, even the hour at which they are generally to be found at home of an evening, for the purposes of assessing pensions and emergency relief. My uncle was most particular that the records be thorough. He chaired the committee that established the practice himself some 20 years ago, and was inordinately proud of the system he had devised. Did he indeed? Said Holmes softly, and I saw in his face that some door, previously shut fast, had swung a very little way open upon a corridor whose far end he could not yet see. I think, Watson, that we shall pay a visit to Chronometer Hall before the day is out, and I should be obliged, Miss Quill, if you would accompany us, for I suspect we shall have need of an introduction that policemen alone could not so readily procure. Chapter 4. The Guild Hall of Chronometers. Chronometer Hall stood in a quiet square not far from the workshop, a building of Georgian solidity whose facade bore, carved above its door in letters worn smooth by 2 centuries of London grime, the Guild's ancient motto, Tempus custodit veritatem, time guards the truth, a sentiment that struck me, given the morning's discoveries, as bitterly ironic. Within, we found ourselves in a hushed world of dark panelling and glass cases displaying 2 centuries of English horological achievement, marine chronometers that had crossed every ocean on Earth, astronomical regulators of a precision that beggared belief, all presided over by a porter who regarded our little party with the wary deference reserved, in such institutions, for policemen and worse. We were shown after some little delay into the presence of the Guild's current deputy master, Mr. Aldous Vane, a tall, spare man of perhaps 60, with a long, melancholy face and ink-stained fingers, who received us in a small office, crowded with ledgers, and the disassembled mechanism of what appeared to be a marine chronometer laid open upon a baize cloth, its 100 small parts arranged with a precision that suggested he had been at work upon it that very morning, despite, or perhaps because of, the events that had shadowed the Guild these 4 days past. "I will not pretend surprise that you have come," said Vane, before Holmes had uttered a single word, setting down a small screwdriver with the weary resignation of a man long accustomed to suspicion. "I am aware the police consider me Renfield's likeliest murderer, and I confess I cannot greatly blame them for it. We quarrelled for 30 years, Mr. Holmes, over matters of Guild governance, over the mastership which I believed should rightly have come to me a decade past, over 100 small humiliations a proud man does not easily forget, however petty they may appear to those outside the quarrel. I will not deny I am glad he is dead. God forgive me for saying so in his own hall. I will deny with everything in me that I killed him, and I trust you are the sort of man who values evidence over the easy satisfaction of an obvious motive." "You are remarkably candid," Holmes observed, seating himself uninvited in the chair opposite, a liberty Vane seemed not in the least to resent. "I am old enough to find dissembling tedious, Mr. Holmes, and I have buried too many friends and too many quarrels alike to trouble myself further with the pretence of grief I do not feel. Ask what you wish, and ask it plainly. Where were you on the night of the murder, between the hours of 8 and midnight, in Birmingham, addressing the Midland Horological Society on the subject of marine escapements, a paper, I may say, that took me the better part of a month to prepare, and that I delivered, I am told, to considerable acclaim, though I should have traded every word of it gladly to have spent the evening elsewhere had I known what would be made of my absence. I have my railway tickets, my hotel bill, and 40 witnesses who heard me speak for the better part of 2 hours. Inspector Lestrade has already confirmed the particulars, I believe, with rather obvious disappointment that they should hold so firm." Lestrade's ears reddened slightly at this, but he did not contradict the statement, merely consulting a small notebook with an air of studied unconcern. "And the disc?" Holmes asked, leaning forward with the particular stillness that I had learned to recognize as the sharpest edge of his attention. "The engraved prophecy. Have you any theory as to its origin, Mr. Vane? Any suspicion, however slight, that you have hesitated to voice?" For the first time, Vane's composure faltered, and he turned away to a cabinet behind his desk, withdrawing a thin ledger bound in worn red leather, which he laid open upon the table between us with the reluctance of a man producing evidence against his own institution. "I have a theory, Mr. Holmes, though I confess it troubles me a good deal to voice it aloud within these walls. This is the Benevolent Fund Register, the very record Miss Quill, I expect, mentioned to you already. It contains the private circumstances of every guild member, their health, their households, their habits of an evening, the hour at which their servants generally retire, even the particular window by which a man is accustomed to sit when reading his paper. Renfield himself insisted upon its thoroughness when the fund was established, He held that a guild which cared properly for its members must know their lives as intimately as a physician knows his patients. It is precisely the sort of document, Mr. Holmes, from which a man might learn, down to the very hour, when another man would be sitting alone in his chair, undisturbed and unsuspecting. And who has access to this register? Myself, in my present capacity, the master when he lived, the guild treasurer, and the archive clerk who maintains the entries and updates them as circumstances change, a tedious labour, but a necessary one. The clerk's name? Tansey, said Vane. Ezra Tansey. A quiet, diligent fellow, been with us 9 years come Michaelmas. Hardly says 3 words a week to anyone, keeps entirely to himself, even at the guild's annual dinners. But his records are immaculate, the finest I have ever had occasion to examine, and I have examined a great many in my time. He paused, frowning, and I saw the first true shadow of suspicion cross his melancholy features. I cannot imagine the connection, Mr. Holmes, but you did ask, and I have learned over 30 years in this guild that the questions you find yourself unable to answer are generally the ones that matter most. Holmes's expression betrayed nothing, though I, who knew him well, observed the faint stillness that came over him whenever a name struck some hidden chord of significance not yet ready to be sounded aloud. "I should very much like to see this register," he said, "and, if it is not too great an imposition upon your morning, to make the acquaintance of Mr. Tansey without delay." "He is not here today," said Vane, consulting a small attendance book upon his desk with a frown of genuine puzzlement. "A family matter," he told the porter. "Asked leave only this morning, most unexpectedly, for he has scarcely missed a day's attendance in 9 years, not even when the influenza swept through half the staff 2 winters past." "This morning," Holmes repeated quietly, and I saw something pass across his face that I could not at first interpret, not quite alarm, but a sharpening of attention, as a hound's ears prick at a distant sound the huntsman has not yet heard. After the murder, but before the second disc, if a second disc there is to be, which I confess I think very probable indeed. Mr. Vane, the register, if you please. Lestrade, I think we had better discover where Mr. Ezra Tansey resides, and do so within the hour, for I do not like the timing of this absence at all. Chapter 5. Mr. Aldous Vane's Alibi. It was characteristic of Holmes that, having apparently fixed upon a most promising line of inquiry, he should immediately turn his attention elsewhere, a habit that exasperated Lestrade beyond measure, and never failed to instruct me, for I had learned over many years that Holmes pursued the obvious suspect with as much rigour as the obscure one, precisely because the obvious suspect so often proved a decoy laid by chance or by design, and a theory built upon an unverified foundation, however elegant its upper stories, was to his mind no theory at all, but merely an indulgence of the imagination. "We shall verify Vane's alibi to the letter before we go further," Holmes said, as our cab rattled toward the Midland Railway offices, through streets now thronged with the ordinary commerce of midday, costermongers and clerks, and omnibuses jostling for space, with an indifference to murder that I always found, in the midst of our investigations, strangely bracing. It would be the height of folly to build an elaborate theory upon Mr. Tansey, while leaving an unexamined gap in our reasoning regarding the man the police already suspect, and have, I have no doubt, already half convicted in their own minds upon the strength of a 30-year-old quarrel. Misdirection, Watson, cuts both ways in a case of this kind. The too obvious suspect is exonerated by careful examination. The too quiet clerk is condemned upon mere suspicion, both perhaps upon insufficient evidence properly weighed, and I will commit neither error if I can help it. At the railway office, a clerk confirmed, after some considerable searching among ledgers that seemed to multiply the longer he searched, that a Mr. A. Vane had indeed purchased a return ticket to Birmingham 4 days prior, departing at 4:30 and not returning until the following noon. The ticket itself, bearing a punch mark that corresponded, the clerk assured us with evident pride in his own thoroughness, to the very train in question. The secretary of the Midland Horological Society, reached by telegram within the hour, and replying with a promptness that did credit to the efficiency of that institution, confirmed with evident pride that Mr. Vane had delivered a most illuminating address upon marine escapements to an audience of no fewer than 60 members, concluding shortly before 10 o'clock, a full hour after Renfield had, according to the engraved prophecy and the coroner's own careful estimate, already been dead in his chair these many minutes. "There," said Holmes, folding the telegram with something close to satisfaction, "Vane is cleared beyond any reasonable doubt, and we may set aside the comfortable theory of an old man's grudge, which I confess I never found entirely satisfying even before this confirmation. For grudges of 30 years' standing rarely erupt into murder without some fresh and immediate provocation, and none has been suggested to us. The Yard, Lestrade, will be obliged to look elsewhere, though I suspect, from the expression upon your face, that you had already begun to suspect as much yourself, whatever the official theory may yet claim in its reports." "I had my doubts," Lestrade admitted, somewhat stiffly, pulling at his collar in the manner of a man uncomfortable with admission. "A man does not generally announce his own murder 4 days in advance, and then go about lecturing on escapements in Birmingham before a room of his peers. It struck me as a poor sort of alibi for a man clever enough to engrave a prophecy, if you take my meaning, Mr. Holmes, too easily checked, too entirely beyond dispute." "Quite so, and a perceptive observation, Lestrade, which I had rather expected of you than not. And yet observe, gentlemen, how very convenient Vane's quarrel with Renfield made him as a suspect. Convenient enough that any but the most careful examination might have stopped there, satisfied, while the true author of this scheme continued his work undisturbed beneath the very noses of the men charged with stopping him. I begin to suspect we are dealing with a mind that understands a good deal about how suspicion naturally falls, and has perhaps arranged matters so that it should fall first, and fall hardest, upon the most quarrelsome, most visible enemy, buying himself time before any closer attention turned toward quieter corners of the Guild's affairs." "You mean Tansey?" "I mean that we have not yet established anything whatever about Tansey, save that he is quiet, diligent, and conveniently absent upon the very morning we sought him. Let us not commit the very error we have just laboured so carefully to avoid with Vane. Watson, what o'clock is it?" "2:30. Then let us proceed to Mr. Tansey's lodgings with open minds and closed mouths, and see what the facts, rather than our fancies, have to tell us. For I have found in 30 years of this work that facts are a far more reliable guide than even the most persuasive intuition, however much the public prefers to imagine otherwise. The lodgings, when we found them after some little difficulty with the address, a narrow house in a respectable but unremarkable street off the city road, indistinguishable from a dozen others save for a freshly whitewashed step that spoke of a landlady proud of her small domain, yielded little at first glance. The landlady, a stout, voluble woman named Mrs. Carrow, who seemed almost grateful for the excitement our visit afforded her otherwise quiet afternoon, informed us that Mr. Tansey was the quietest lodger she had ever kept in 20 years of letting rooms, paid his rent a full week in advance without fail, never entertained visitors of any description, and had left that very morning with a single carpet-bag, saying only that he had urgent family business in the country, and could not say when he would return. A statement that had struck even Mrs. Carrow as curious, given what she described as Mr. Tansey's previously avowed lack of any family whatever. "Family business," Holmes murmured, as we stood in the small, scrupulously tidy room that had until that morning housed Ezra Tansey, a room so bare of personal ornament that it might have belonged to a monk rather than a man of 9 years' settled residence. "And does Mr. Tansey possess any family, Mrs. Carrow, that you are aware of, despite his statement this morning?" "None that ever called, sir. in all the years he has lodged with me. Indeed, I always thought him quite alone in the world, and said so to my late husband more than once, for it seemed a sad sort of life for so quiet and respectable a gentleman. He told me once his people were all dead these many years, and I never had cause to doubt it until this very morning. Holmes said nothing for a long moment, but I observed him cross to the small writing desk by the window, where he stood for a long moment regarding a single object left behind, seemingly forgotten in the haste of departure, atop the blotting pad. A child's tin soldier, its paint worn nearly away by handling, of a kind sold cheaply in street markets some 20 years before, and which struck me, even before Holmes had said a word, as a strangely poignant relic for so solitary and orderly a man to have kept. Chapter 6. The Niece's Inheritance. We returned to Baker Street that evening in a sombre mood, for the trail to Tansy had gone suddenly and frustratingly cold, despite every effort Lestrade's men could bring to bear, and Lestrade had been obliged to set every constable in the district to the business of locating him, without, as yet, the smallest success to report. Holmes ate almost nothing at dinner, a circumstance Mrs. Hudson remarked upon with visible disapproval as she cleared the plates, and spent the better part of the evening turning the engraved disc over and over in his long fingers before the fire, saying scarcely a word, his pipe gone cold beside him more than once without his apparent notice. It was the following morning, as we sat over a late breakfast in the grey light of another fog-bound day, that a telegram arrived which altered the complexion of the case entirely, and set Holmes upon his feet before he had finished reading it. Lestrade had wired to say that, upon further examination of Renfield's will, filed, as it happened, only 6 weeks before his death, a circumstance that struck even Lestrade by his own admission as worthy of remark, it had been discovered that Helena Quill stood to inherit not merely her uncle's workshop and tools, but the whole of his considerable fortune, amounting to some £11,000, a sum that would have made her, at a stroke, one of the more comfortably situated young women of her acquaintance. "A motive, Watson, of the most ordinary and venerable kind," said Holmes, passing me the telegram with an expression of distaste he did not trouble to hide. "Money. I confess I find it disappointing after the intricacy of the disc, which suggested a mind of altogether more interesting cast than mere avarice generally produces. But disappointment is no argument against truth, however much I might wish it otherwise. We had better speak with Miss Quill again, and this time rather more searchingly than our courtesy permitted upon our first acquaintance." We found her at the workshop, engaged in the melancholy task of cataloguing her uncle's tools for the solicitors, her composure, I thought, somewhat more brittle than it had been the previous day, as though the accumulated weight of grief and suspicion together had begun at last to tell upon her. When Holmes raised the matter of the will, she did not flinch, but set down the gear she had been examining with great deliberateness, as though to steady her hands before they betrayed her further. "I knew you would learn of it," she said, meeting his gaze directly despite the colour that had risen in her cheeks. "I ought to have told you myself yesterday, and I see now that my silence makes me appear exactly as guilty as the police already suspect, which was the very last impression I wished to create. I did not mention the will because I did not believe it relevant to a murder I cannot for one moment imagine myself capable of, and because, Mr. Holmes, I had a far better reason to fear my uncle's enemies than any wish to inherit from him, a reason I have been reluctant to voice until I understood it better myself. Pray explain, and pray omit nothing, however small it may seem to you." She drew a long breath, and I saw her gather herself as though for some difficult confession. "6 months ago, I began to suspect something was deeply wrong within the Guild's affairs, something concerning the Benevolent Fund and an old investment my uncle had championed many years before, in a canal scheme that failed disastrously and ruined a number of lesser members who had trusted his assurances without question, for his word carried great weight in those days. I found correspondence among his papers suggesting the failure had been concealed, or at least its true causes obscured, to protect the reputations of the gentlemen who had managed the investment, and who stood, I think, to lose a great deal more than money, should the truth ever properly emerge. I hired a private inquiry agent to look into it. Quietly, you understand, for I did not wish to accuse my own uncle of dishonesty without proof, and I loved him, Mr. Holmes, whatever his failings. I had hoped, foolishly perhaps, to persuade him to make some restitution to the families who suffered before the matter ever became public and brought disgrace upon his name. And did you find proof? Some. Enough to trouble me very greatly indeed. The agent's final report arrived only 2 days before my uncle's death, and I have not yet had the courage to read the whole of it, for I confess I fear what it may yet reveal. Both of my uncle and of others I had thought beyond reproach. She withdrew from a locked drawer a slim folder, which she handed to Holmes with visible and understandable reluctance, her fingers lingering upon it a moment before she let it go. I do not believe I killed my uncle for £11,000, Mr. Holmes, whatever the police may choose to suppose. I believe, rather, that someone killed him for a debt 20 years old, and I am very much afraid that my own inquiries have only quickened a tragedy that was already, in some terrible sense, long overdue and merely waiting for its hour. Holmes opened the folder and read in silence, his expression growing graver with each page he turned, until at last he looked up with an intensity that I had seen in him only at the very threshold of some great discovery, an intensity that seemed almost to crackle in the close air of the workshop. "Miss Quill," he said quietly, "I believe you have just placed in my hands the single most important document in this entire affair, and I confess I had not expected the thread to lead quite so directly to its source. Tell me, does the name Walter Hartwell appear anywhere within it?" She paled visibly, one hand going to the workbench as though for support. "It is the very first name, Mr. Holmes. He was a clock case carver who invested every penny he possessed upon my uncle's personal assurance that the canal scheme could not fail, an assurance my uncle gave, I believe, in good faith but with culpable carelessness as to its accuracy. He lost everything, every shilling of his savings, the whole labour of a working lifetime. He drowned himself in the Thames not 8 months later, leaving, I believe, a young son entirely alone in the world, a fact that has weighed upon my conscience these 6 months past more heavily than I have confessed to anyone until this moment." Chapter 7. A second disc arrives. We had scarcely absorbed the significance of this revelation, Holmes still turning the agent's report slowly between his fingers, as though it were itself some intricate mechanism whose workings he had not quite finished tracing, when a constable arrived at the workshop, breathless from running, bearing a message from Lestrade that drove every other consideration from our minds at a stroke. A second disc had been delivered, not to a newspaper this time, but directly to Scotland Yard itself, addressed to Lestrade by name, in the same careful block capitals, a development that seemed to me, when I considered it, a particularly chilling escalation of confidence on the murderer's part. We found the inspector in his office, the disc lying upon his blotting pad as though he could not bring himself to touch it more than the briefest necessity required, his face drawn and pale beneath the gaslight. It was identical in form to the first, the same fine engraving, the same cryptic economy of verse that I had already begun to recognize as a kind of grim signature. The banker counted other men's gold, and weighed their ruin, calm and cold. J.P. 23 past the 8th hour, the morrow next. Alderman Josiah Pratt, said Lestrade grimly, consulting a paper with hands that were not quite steady. A retired banker, a guild member of long standing, lives alone in Islington with a single housekeeper of advanced years. I have already sent men to watch his house, but Mr. Holmes, the morrow next. We have less than a day to act, and I do not mind telling you I have rarely felt so thoroughly outmatched by a single adversary in all my years at the Yard. Holmes took up the disc and examined it with the same minute attention he had given the first, his lens close to the metal, his lips moving very slightly as he traced each letter. "The hand is identical," he said at last. "The same graver, the same depth of stroke, the same peculiar economy of phrase. Our murderer composes his verses, I observe, with the precision of a man balancing a ledger, never a syllable wasted, never an ornament permitted that does not serve the sentence's necessary weight. Lestrade, was Alderman Pratt a member of the committee that sanctioned the canal investment 20 years ago, as I begin to suspect he must have been? Lestrade consulted a paper upon his desk, his brow furrowing as he searched. How could you possibly— Yes, he was. Here it is. The Severn Valley Ship Canal Company. I find it called in this old minute book. The clerk dug out for me. Pratt managed the disbursement of the Guild's funds into the venture as Treasurer's deputy. Renfield chaired the committee that approved it. There were two others named besides. A Dr. Increase Hobbs, the Guild's physician and actuary, who certified the scheme financially sound upon his own professional reputation, and a Mr. Cornelius Stoke, the treasurer at the time, who signed the final disbursement. And Stoke, dead these 11 years, of natural causes, I am informed by the Guild's own records, and buried, I should think, beyond any reach of this murderer's particular justice. Then our murderer's ledger contains but 3 living debts to collect, and has already settled the first with a precision that should give us all considerable pause, said Holmes, rising and beginning to pace the small office with the restless energy of a man whose mind has outrun the room's confines. We must protect Alderman Pratt with every resource at your disposal, Lestrade, though I confess I hold out little hope of a success purchased by mere numbers of constables. A mind capable of such patience, having committed itself publicly to an hour and a minute before witnesses it does not even trouble to identify, will not, I think, be easily deflected from keeping his appointment, whatever obstacles are placed in his path. We spent that night, by Holmes's particular and exacting arrangement, concealed within Alderman Pratt's own house in Islington. Holmes in the dressing-room adjoining the old gentleman's bedchamber, where he could watch both door and window at once, I in the passage below with my revolver close at hand, and 2 of Lestrade's most reliable constables stationed at every entrance, front and rear, with instructions repeated so often that even the dullest among them could scarcely have mistaken their importance. Pratt himself, a stout, querulous man made thoroughly disagreeable by terror he was too proud to admit, complained bitterly throughout the long evening of the indignity of being guarded in his own home like a common felon, and retired at last to bed grumbling that the whole business was a hoax, got up by his enemies at the Guild to frighten him into an early grave through sheer nervous exhaustion. At 23 minutes past 8 the following morning, for the night passed agonizingly, without the smallest incident to disturb our vigil, I heard from below a sound that I shall not soon forget so long as I live, a single, sharp cry, cut terribly short from the small breakfast room at the rear of the house, where Pratt had gone, against every instruction we had so carefully impressed upon him, to take his chocolate alone by the window while his guards changed their watch upon the stair. A brief gap of no more than 4 minutes that none of us had thought. We found him slumped across the table, a thin steel watch chain drawn tight about his throat, the window behind him standing open to a yard we had, in our confidence, left unwatched for those 4 fatal minutes, the morning light falling cold and indifferent across a scene that I confess struck me with a horror scarcely diminished by my long familiarity with violent death. Chapter 8. The Hidden Ledger. Holmes said almost nothing as we stood over the second body, though I observed in him a controlled fury such as I had rarely witnessed in all our years together, not directed at any person present, but at himself, at the 4 unwatched minutes that had cost an old man his life despite every precaution we had thought, in our pride, entirely sufficient to the danger. It was Lestrade who first gave voice to the despair we all felt pressing upon us in that small, ruined breakfast room. He has beaten us again, Mr. Holmes, and made fools of the lot of us in the bargain, with 2 constables in the very house, and you yourself not 30 feet distant. How does a man slip past such a guard, to strangle his victim in broad daylight, and vanish without a trace, without so much as a footprint in that yard to mark his passage? He does not slip past us, Lestrade, said Holmes quietly, kneeling to examine the sill of the open window with his lens, his anger now entirely subdued beneath the cold discipline of his method. He calculates us, with a precision that I confess I find almost as remarkable as it is monstrous. He knew, or guessed with remarkable exactness, through long study of habit, that a change of watch would occur at that hour, that an old man impatient of confinement would seek some small liberty the very moment he believed himself briefly unobserved. For such men always do, Watson. It is the oldest weakness in human nature. This was not chance. This was the same patient study of habit and circumstance that produced the engraved prophecy in the first place, applied now to the practical business of execution. Our murderer does not merely know when his victims are alone. He knows why they will be alone, and arranges, where necessary, the small persuasions that ensure it comes to pass exactly as he requires. He rose and crossed to the breakfast table, where Pratt's chocolate sat cooling untouched but for a single sip, beside a folded copy of that morning's Times, open, I noticed upon closer examination, to the agony column, among its clutter of lost dogs and matrimonial entreaties, and small private notices that mean nothing to the casual eye. Watson, look here. Holmes indicated a small advertisement, easily overlooked amid the column's general clutter. A.P. Your old friend from the canal awaits you in the breakfast room at the usual hour. Come alone, as you always have. Pratt received this only this morning, folded into his own newspaper, before any of us rose to relieve the night watch, by some means we have not yet traced, and must trace without delay. It drew him to that window at that hour as surely as a hand laid upon his shoulder, and none of us thought to examine his correspondence so closely, because none of us yet understood that our murderer required no violence whatever to compel his victims into position, only the right words, addressed with surgical precision to a guilty conscience that had carried its burden, unconfessed, for 20 years. It was at this point that Holmes, kneeling once more beside the body with a thoroughness that betrayed nothing of haste, despite the urgency of the hour, discovered beneath the lip of the table a small slip of paper that had evidently fallen, unnoticed by the murderer, in the brief violence of the act, perhaps torn loose from a pocket in the final struggle. He examined it for a long moment in silence, his back to us so that I could not see his face, before folding it carefully into his pocket-book, and I observed that he did not show it even to Lestrade, a reticence that struck me at the time as uncharacteristic, though I said nothing before the inspector. "What have you found?" I asked, when we had withdrawn at last to the passage away from Lestrade's men and their grim, methodical work. "A confirmation, Watson, of a theory I have entertained since yesterday, and which I do not yet wish to voice aloud, for fear of being wrong in a manner that might yet cost a third man his life through some premature action on our part. I will tell you this much, and no more for the present. Our murderer is not merely avenging a private grief, however just that grief may be in its origin. He is settling, with the most exacting arithmetic, a debt he believes was never properly paid by the law or by society, and I begin to fear that he regards his task as something very near to sacred duty. Such men, Watson, are the most dangerous of all adversaries, for they do not kill from passion, which burns itself out in its own heat, and leaves a man spent and remorseful. They kill from conviction, which does not burn out at all, but burns steadily, like a well-tended fire, for as long as fuel remains to feed it. And Dr. Hobbes is, at this moment, the last living entry remaining in a ledger that has already been balanced twice over with terrible efficiency. We must reach him before our murderer does. And this time, Lestrade, he turned to the inspector, who had come to join us with a face grown grey with strain. We shall not rely merely upon watching a house, which we have seen fail us once already to our lasting shame. We shall set a trap, and we shall set it upon ground of our own choosing, not his. And we shall not repeat this morning's error. Chapter 9. Blood on the Cathedral Clock. It was not, however, given to us to choose the ground so easily as Holmes had hoped, for Dr. Increase Hobbs proved a man of obstinate habits and considerable vanity, who flatly refused. When we called upon him that same afternoon in his comfortable rooms near Gray's Inn, surrounded by the trappings of professional success he had plainly spent a lifetime accumulating, to alter so much as a single particular of his daily life upon the strength of what he termed, with a dismissive wave of one plump hand, a parlour trick with engraved brass got up to frighten foolish old men. "I am a man of science, Mr. Holmes," said he, a portly, self-satisfied gentleman, with mutton-chop whiskers, and a habit of addressing us, as though from a lecture platform, before some assembly of credulous students. "And I do not propose to cower in my own house, because some criminal lunatic has taken it into his head to play at prophecy with a few lines of doggerel and a brass trinket. I shall keep my appointments exactly as I always do, precisely as I have done these 40 years without the smallest deviation, and if your famous deductive powers cannot protect a man going about his ordinary business in broad daylight, then I confess I had overrated their celebrated reputation, rather more than the popular press would seem to justify." Holmes's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, but he said only, with that icy courtesy he reserved for fools of consequence whom circumstance obliged him to humour, "Then I beg you will at least permit Dr. Watson and myself to accompany you upon your rounds today, Doctor, that we may at least observe what habits we are unable, it seems, to alter through any argument of reason." Hobbs consented, with poor grace and a good deal of grumbling about the inconvenience of being shadowed like a common criminal, and it was thus that we found ourselves, an hour later, climbing the long spiral stair of St. Aldrich's, a fictitious dedication, I should explain for clarity, of a venerable city church, whose great clock Hobbs, in his capacity as the guild's actuary and a noted amateur of horology in his own right, was in the habit of inspecting each week, a small vanity he indulged with the evident pride of a man who liked to be seen attending to important mechanisms by whatever verger or curious passer-by happened to observe his ascent. The clockroom, high above the nave and reached by a stair that left even my own sound constitution somewhat winded, was a cramped chamber of iron and brass where the great movement turned with a slow, deliberate majesty, its enormous pendulum swinging through the gloom like the slow breathing of some vast sleeping creature confined within the church's very bones, the whole mechanism filling the small space with a ticking so loud and so regular that conversation itself seemed almost an intrusion upon its rhythm. Hobbs busied himself with officious, largely unnecessary adjustments to the escapement, lecturing us all the while upon the principles of gravity-driven timekeeping with the tedious thoroughness of a man who has found, in his own small expertise, a refuge from every larger anxiety, entirely oblivious to the tension that had settled, taut as drawn wire, across Holmes's countenance the moment we had entered that confined and echoing chamber. It was Holmes who first heard it, a footstep upon the stair below, soft, deliberate, unhurried, the tread of a man entirely confident of his welcome, and in no apparent haste to conceal his approach. He moved with extraordinary speed for so spare a frame, positioning himself instantly beside the door, with a hand raised for silence, his whole body gone suddenly still in that particular way I had seen him assume before in moments of greatest danger, like a creature of the hunt catching, at last, the scent it has been seeking. The footsteps reached the landing and paused there, just beyond the door, for a long moment that seemed to stretch beyond all reasonable measure. Then, quite calmly, a voice spoke from the darkness of the stairwell, soft, precise, almost gentle, with none of the menace I had somehow expected of a man who had twice already proven himself a murderer. "Dr. Hobbs, I have come, as I said I would, at 3:40 past the hour of 3, and I find I am exactly on time, as I have always endeavoured to be, in every transaction of my life." Holmes flung open the door, and I saw, for one fleeting instant in the grey light filtering through the clock-face windows, a slight, unremarkable man in a dark coat, his face curiously calm, almost serene, as he regarded us without the smallest sign of alarm or surprise, as though our presence there had been entirely anticipated and accounted for in whatever calculation had brought him to that stare. "Mr. Sherlock Holmes," said Ezra Tansey, for it was he, beyond any possibility of doubt, with a small, courteous inclination of his head that struck me, even in that moment of tension, as almost absurdly civil. "I had rather hoped to meet you under more agreeable circumstances. I have read of your methods with considerable admiration these several years, and have followed your published cases with an attention I suspect you would find flattering were the present circumstances otherwise. It is a pity our acquaintance must begin in such a fashion, but I have found, Mr. Holmes, that pity is a luxury I gave up the right to indulge some years ago." And before any of us could move, before even Holmes's quick hand could close upon him, he had turned and was gone down the stair with a swiftness that belied his earlier calm, vanishing into the crowded streets of the city with a speed and a composure that left Holmes, for one of the very few occasions in our long acquaintance, entirely and visibly astonished, standing motionless in the doorway as the footsteps faded below us into the general roar of the city's afternoon traffic. Chapter 10. The Pattern in the Provident Fund. That Tansey had escaped us was a bitter disappointment, the more bitter for having had him so nearly within our grasp. But Holmes, recovering his composure with characteristic speed once the first shock of the encounter had passed, declared, before we had even descended the church stair, that the meeting had given him a great deal more than it had cost us in wounded pride. "He spoke to us, Watson. He did not merely flee at the sight of us, as any common criminal would have done the instant he perceived discovery. A man who pauses, at the very moment of his unmasking, to express admiration for my methods and regret for the manner of our acquaintance, is a man who wishes, on some level he has perhaps not fully examined even in his own mind, to be understood, perhaps even to be caught eventually, provided only that he is caught after his work is finished, and not a moment before. That is a significant weakness in an otherwise formidable adversary, and I intend to make full and deliberate use of it before this affair concludes." We returned that evening to Baker Street in a mood considerably more purposeful than our earlier dejection had suggested possible, where Holmes spread before him upon the table the report Helena Quill had given us, the Guild's Benevolent Fund register procured from Vane under some little protest, and a sheaf of parish and workhouse records he had dispatched a messenger boy to retrieve that very afternoon from records offices scattered across the city, a labour, I should say, that would have occupied any ordinary investigator for the better part of a week, and which Holmes, with the assistance of an extravagant quantity of telegraph forms and no small expenditure of coin pressed into willing hands, accomplished before midnight had struck, the boy returning twice more with fresh bundles, even as we sat over our pipes. "Walter Hartwell," said Holmes, laying the documents out in careful sequence upon the cleared table, like a hand of cards whose pattern was only now becoming fully apparent even to himself. "Clock-case carver, of Hoxton, invested the whole of his savings, some £400, the patient labour of a working lifetime, in the Severn Valley Ship Canal Company, upon the personal written assurance of Silas Renfield, then chairman of the Guild's Investment Committee, and upon the actuarial certification of Dr. Increase Hobbs, who pronounced the scheme financially sound in a document I have here before me, signed in his own unmistakable hand. The company failed in 1869, owing to a missed construction deadline and the consequent collapse of credit that followed such failures with grim regularity in that decade. Hartwell was ruined utterly and without recourse. He drowned himself in the Thames at Wapping Stairs in March of 1871, leaving a widow already some years dead, and a single son, aged 10, who was taken into the parish workhouse at Shoreditch within the month, as these records here so starkly confirm. And the son? Apprenticed at 13 to an engraver of Clerkenwell, a Mr. Josiah Tansey, long since dead himself, whose surname the boy appears subsequently to have adopted entirely as his own, his original name being, as the workhouse records confirm beyond any doubt, Thomas Hartwell, a name he abandoned along with every other trace of the boy he had once been. He took employment with the Guild's Benevolent Fund Archive 9 years ago, under the name Ezra Tansey, presenting forged credentials of unremarkable quality that nonetheless sufficed, for no one thought to question so quiet and diligent a clerk, applying for so modest and unglamorous a position. From that position he has had, for the better part of a decade, complete and entirely unsupervised access to the private circumstances, health, habits, household arrangements, the small unguarded hours of an ordinary evening, of every gentleman responsible, 20 years ago, for his father's ruin and subsequent death. He has been planning this for 9 years. I believe he has been preparing for 9 years, Watson, which is a different matter altogether, and a far more terrible one to contemplate. The engraving, the patient cultivation of routine knowledge, the cold precision of the verses, the very choice of weapon in each case drawn from the victim's own trade or circumstance. These are not the work of a man in the grip of sudden passion, however justified that passion might in some measure be. They are the work of a man who has made of his revenge a kind of craft, polished and perfected across nearly a decade of silent, patient labour, as a watchmaker might spend years upon years perfecting a single complicated movement before ever he sets it finally in motion before an audience. Then why has he killed only now, after waiting so very long already? Holmes was silent a moment, his eyes upon the fire, the flickering light catching the sharp planes of his face in a manner that lent him, in that instant, an almost haunted aspect I rarely saw in him otherwise. "I suspect," he said at last, slowly, as though reasoning the matter through, even as he spoke it aloud for the first time, "that Miss Quill's private inquiry, begun some 6 months past with the best of intentions, alarmed him considerably, that he feared discovery of the old fraud was now imminent through her efforts, and resolved to complete his ledger before any other hand could close it for him and rob him of the reckoning he had spent 9 years preparing. He is not merely avenging his father, Watson, though that grief lies at the very root of everything he has done. He believes himself the instrument of a justice the law itself failed entirely to deliver, and he means to finish his accounts whatever the eventual cost to himself, or indeed to us, who now stand between him and that final, terrible completion. Then Hobbs remains in very real danger. Hobbs remains the last entry in that ledger, said Holmes, rising abruptly from his chair with sudden decision, and our adversary, having shown his hand so openly at St. Aldrich's, will know full well that his methods of approach are now thoroughly known to us. He will be obliged to alter his plan in some particular, and it is precisely in the alteration of a fixed and rigid mind, Watson, accustomed for 9 years to a single unwavering purpose, that such a man becomes at last most vulnerable to discovery. We have, I think, one further opportunity to end this, before a third death is added to his ledger, and we must not waste it through any further error of overconfidence. Chapter 11. The Third Name. It was 3 days before the third disc arrived. 3 days during which Holmes, with a patience that tried my own nerves very considerably indeed, declined to press Dr. Hobbs into any further immediate precaution beyond the constable already stationed without, declaring instead that we must allow our adversary the rope by which, in due course and through his own rigid habits, he would hang himself, a strategy I confess I found difficult to endure, given the stakes so plainly at hazard. The disc, when it came at last, was delivered not by post this time but by hand, slipped beneath the door of Hobbs's chambers sometime in the deep watches of the night, undetected entirely by the constable Lestrade had stationed, with poor grace upon Hobbs's part at the continued inconvenience, in the street outside. Its verse ran, in that same fine and economical copperplate we had now come to dread. He weighed the risk and called it light, and slept while ruin stole the night. I.H. The 7th hour, 2 evenings hence. 2 evenings hence, said Lestrade grimly, when Holmes laid the disk before him upon his desk the following morning. That gives us scarcely 48 hours, Mr. Holmes, and our man has already proven himself entirely capable of striking through a guarded window with constables not 4 minutes absent from their post. I confess I do not know how we are to better that record of failure within so short a span. He has also, said Holmes, turning the disk slowly between his fingers as he spoke, proven himself a creature of fixed and almost ceremonial habit, a trait that I intend to turn against him most particularly in this final encounter. Consider, Lestrade, in both previous murders he announced his hour with absolute exactness, and kept that hour with absolute exactness, even at very considerable risk to his own subsequent escape, when a few minutes' latitude either way might have served his safety far better. He did not strike early to seize an unexpected opportunity that circumstance might have offered him, nor did he delay when conditions grew difficult or dangerous. He is bound, I believe, by some private and unshakable conviction that the hour itself possesses a kind of sacred authority over his actions, that to kill before or after the appointed minute would somehow corrupt the very justice he believes himself to be administering on his father's behalf. You think him mad, then, for all his evident cleverness? I think him entirely sane, Lestrade, which is by far the more dangerous condition of the two, and one the public seldom troubles to distinguish from madness, though the difference is profound. A madman acts upon impulse, and impulse may be anticipated only roughly, by guess and general principle. A sane man bound by a self-imposed law of his own devising acts with perfect predictability, and predictability, gentlemen, is the one gift our adversary has, all unwittingly, given into our hands. Holmes turned to me with sudden decision in his eye. Watson, I require your medical bag, and I require it within the hour, for I intend to make use of it in a manner you will, I think, find rather unconventional even by the standards of our previous adventures together. I confess I had no notion, at that moment, of the scheme already forming in his rapid mind, and it was not until that evening, when Holmes laid out before me a plan of such audacity that I very nearly refused outright to have any part in it, that the full and rather alarming shape of his intention became entirely clear to me. You propose, I said, scarcely able to credit what I had heard, to disguise Dr. Hobbs's own house and Dr. Hobbs himself behind a substitute, and to place yourself, in person, in the very chair where Hobbs is meant by this murderer to die. I propose precisely that, Watson, and I will own the proposal has cost me a certain measure of careful thought, for the risk is not inconsiderable. Our adversary has studied his victims with extraordinary thoroughness, but he has not, I think, studied me with quite the same patient attention, and a man who has spent 9 years cultivating the patient anonymity of a clerk is unlikely to recognize, in the dim and failing light of a single November evening, the substitution of one greying, portly figure for another, provided the substitution is managed with sufficient and meticulous care, and provided I am willing to sit very still indeed, in a position from which a swift and determined man might, in one unguarded instant, attempt to place a chain about my throat before any alarm can be raised. Holmes, this is plain madness, if your timing should fail by even a few seconds. Then you, Watson, who will be concealed not 6 feet distant with your revolver primed, and your aim, I have every confidence, as steady as it has ever been in our long association, will ensure that it does not fail at the critical moment. I have considerable confidence in your nerve and your accuracy, my dear fellow, and somewhat less confidence, I confess, in Dr. Hobbs's own capacity to sit perfectly still under the immediate threat of imminent strangulation, vain and obstinate as he has shown himself throughout this entire affair. The substitution, on balance, strikes me as very considerably the safer course for all concerned, even if it is, I grant you readily, rather harder upon my own nerves than I should generally choose to risk in the ordinary course of our work. Chapter 12. Holmes sets the clock. The 2 days that followed were given over to preparation of a thoroughness I had rarely seen Holmes apply even to the most demanding and dangerous of our previous adventures together. Dr. Hobbs, removed under heavy and somewhat undignified escort to a quiet hotel in Bayswater under an assumed name, protested the indignity with undiminished vigour at every stage of the proceeding, though I observed that his protests grew considerably less voluble once Holmes had made him understand, in terms even his considerable vanity could not readily dismiss or argue away, the exact manner of his predecessors' deaths, and the precision with which the same fate now plainly awaited him. His chambers, meanwhile, were prepared with meticulous and exhaustive care under Holmes's personal supervision. Holmes himself, with the assistance of a theatrical wig-maker of his acquaintance in Drury Lane, summoned for the purpose at considerable expense, was transformed by careful stages into a passable and indeed remarkably convincing likeness of the doctor. The mutton-chop whiskers fixed with practised skill, the stout padding worked beneath his coat to alter the very silhouette of his spare frame, even the particular stoop of Hobbs's shoulders, studied and copied, with an attention to detail that left me, who had seen Holmes assume 100 disguises over the long course of our acquaintance, genuinely astonished anew at the sheer completeness of the deception he could conjure when the occasion demanded it. The chief difficulty, Holmes explained, as Lestrade's constables took up positions in the mews behind the house and in the rooms immediately adjoining the study, all concealed from any view obtainable from the street or from the rear yard, lies not merely in resembling Hobbs to a casual or distant glance, which is a comparatively simple matter of costume and bearing, but in resembling his habits, his particular manner of taking his evening glass of port at precisely 6:30 without fail, his settled custom of reading the evening paper by the western window until the light fails entirely, his small unconscious trick of clearing his throat twice before settling fully into his chair for the evening. Our adversary has studied these habits for months, very possibly for years, with the same patience he has brought to every other particular of his design, and the smallest deviation from the expected pattern may alert him before he commits himself within our reach, undoing the whole of our careful preparation in an instant. And if he does not come at all tonight, if he has somehow guessed the trap we have laid for him, then Hobbs lives to see another day, and we have lost nothing whatever but our patience, which I have in rather greater supply at present than our friend Lestrade, I think, presently believes of me. But I do not think he will stay away, Watson, whatever caution might counsel him. He has waited 9 long years to balance his ledger to the very last entry. He will not now abandon that final reckoning for the sake of a caution that his own rigid sense of ceremony and self-imposed duty will tell him is unworthy of the great task he has set himself to accomplish, whatever danger it may now plainly involve. I was posted, as Holmes had promised me, in a small dressing closet adjoining the study. The door left a careful half-inch ajar to afford me a narrow but sufficient view, my revolver loaded and primed, and my hand, I confess without shame, considerably less steady than I should have wished, as the appointed hour of 7 o'clock drew slowly and almost unbearably nearer through that long November afternoon. Through the gap I could see Holmes, or rather Hobbs, so complete and convincing was the illusion even at this close range, seated in the great chair by the western window, the evening paper held before him in a posture of perfect, studied unconcern, the last grey light of the failing afternoon dying slowly across the room's familiar furnishings. The minutes crept by with a torturous deliberation that seemed, in the deepening silence, almost audible in itself, each separate tick of the mantel clock upon the chimney-piece, falling like a small, distinct eternity into the stillness. At 6:50 past 6, I heard, very faintly, the soft scrape of a window being eased upward somewhere at the rear of the house, a sound so slight and so carefully managed that I might, in any other circumstance entirely, have dismissed it without a second thought as merely the settling of old and weathered timber. Holmes, in the chair, did not stir by so much as a hair's breadth. The paper remained perfectly motionless before his face, exactly as Hobbes himself would have held it at that hour. Only I, watching through my narrow gap with every nerve in my body drawn taut as a bowstring, perceived the faint, deliberate stillness of a man who has heard precisely what he expected and hoped to hear, and is now counting, with perfect and unhurried composure, the slow seconds remaining before the appointed and inevitable hour. Chapter 13. The Vigil at Cheapside. He came at 7:03, not through the window, as the earlier sound had so carefully suggested he might, but through the study door itself, which he had evidently unlatched from within during some earlier and entirely unnoticed visit to the house, for he entered without the smallest hesitation or caution, a slight, unremarkable figure in a dark coat, a coil of fine steel watch chain held loosely and almost casually in one gloved hand, as though it were no more than some ordinary tool of his former trade. "Dr. Hobbes," he said softly, his voice precisely as calm, as gently and terribly courteous as it had been upon the stair at St. Aldrich's some days before. "I am sorry to have kept you waiting these 3 minutes past the hour I named. I find I cannot, even now, after everything, bring myself to act before the appointed time. It would seem, I think, a discourtesy to the dead whose memory I serve, and I have never in my life been a discourteous man, whatever else I have now become." Holmes, still motionless in the chair, the paper yet held before his face in that perfect, unbroken posture of calm, made no reply whatever, and I saw Tansy's gloved hand tighten slowly upon the chain as he stepped closer across the carpet, his footfall silent and deliberate, his entire attention fixed with absolute and terrible concentration upon the figure before him, the concentration of a man approaching the final, most delicate and long-awaited stage of a labour 9 years in its patient making. It was at the very instant that he raised the chain at last, his lips moving in what I took to be some private formula of accusation or perhaps of absolution learned and rehearsed across all those silent years, that Holmes lowered the paper and rose from the chair with a swiftness that seemed, after so long and so perfect a stillness, almost supernatural in its sudden violence, seizing the descending wrist in an iron grip, even as I burst from the closet in the same instant with my revolver already levelled and steady before me. "I think not, Mr. Hartwell," said Holmes, and I confess the use of that true and long-buried name, spoken aloud at such a moment of crisis, struck even me with a kind of physical shock, though I will own freely that you have conducted your ledger with a thoroughness and a patience I cannot help but admire, even as I am now obliged, by every duty I hold dear, to close it forever on your behalf. Tansy, I shall call him so still, for it was by that adopted name we had come to know him through these strange days, did not struggle in Holmes's grasp, not even for an instant. He stood quite still, the chain falling at last from his fingers to the carpet with a small, final sound, and regarded the false whiskers, the padded coat, the whole elaborate and now revealed deception, with an expression in which astonishment was very swiftly overtaken by something closer to a weary and almost peaceful recognition, as though some long and exhausting labour had finally, after so many years, reached its natural and inevitable conclusion. "You knew," he said simply, his voice quite without rancour. "From St. Aldrich's onward, you knew it must come to this, did you not? Even before I myself fully understood the danger I had walked into that day." "I suspected," said Holmes, releasing the wrist now that Lestrade's men had moved to secure him properly, "though I did not know with absolute certainty until this very evening that you would keep your appointment regardless of the manifest and growing risk to yourself. That, Mr. Hartwell, was your single and perhaps your only error in an otherwise nearly faultless design, not a failure of intellect, which you possess in remarkable measure, but a failure, if I may put it so without unkindness, of flexibility in the face of changed and dangerous circumstance. You bound yourself to the hour as rigidly as the very clocks your poor father once carved cases for in his own honest trade, and in that rigidity, I confess to you freely, I find something almost tragic rather than merely criminal. Lestrade's constables had by now flooded into the room in some number, and Tansey was secured without the smallest further incident or resistance whatever, his strange calm entirely unbroken, even as the iron bracelets closed about his wrists with a final, metallic finality. It was only as they led him at last toward the door that he turned once more, unexpectedly, to address Holmes directly with what struck me as genuine and unforced courtesy. "You will want the whole truth of it, I expect, before the courts have their formal say in the matter, and I find, rather to my own considerable surprise after everything, that I do not greatly object to giving it freely. A ledger, Mr. Holmes, is no true ledger at all until every entry is properly accounted for and balanced to the final farthing, and I should not like, of all things, to leave even my own confession incomplete or improperly recorded." Chapter 14. The Final Wind. We gathered that same night, by Holmes's particular arrangement, and not without considerable persuasion upon Lestrade's part to secure the necessary permissions, in the same small chamber above Renfield's workshop, where the case had first begun, some 12 days before. Lestrade himself, Helena Quill, the recovered and considerably humbled Dr. Hobbs, and the prisoner himself, seated under careful guard, but entirely composed, almost serene in his bearing, as Holmes laid the whole intricate construction of the affair before us with the patient thoroughness of a man determined that no particular, however small, should go unexplained. "The truth, gentlemen, and you, Miss Quill, is this," Holmes began, standing before the cold grate where the murder had been committed 12 days before, the irony of the setting plainly not lost upon him. 20 years ago, 4 men of standing within the worshipful company of chronometer makers persuaded a humble clock-case carver named Walter Hartwell to invest the whole of his life's hard-earned savings in a canal scheme that subsequently failed through mismanagement and misplaced confidence, ruining him utterly and driving him, 8 months later, to take his own life in the cold waters of the Thames rather than face his family's destitution. His son, Thomas, then a boy of 10 years, was consigned to the parish workhouse, and there might the whole sad matter have ended forever, in the silent obscurity to which the poor are so often and so completely condemned by the indifference of their betters, save that young Thomas Hartwell possessed an unusually keen and patient mind, and a still more unusual and terrible capacity for sustained purpose across the slow passage of years. He apprenticed himself, in time, to an engraver, Holmes continued, pacing now with slow deliberation as he spoke, and in due course took that engraver's name entirely as his own, presenting himself eventually for employment at the very guild that had, however unwittingly, destroyed his father in the one position, archive clerk to the benevolent fund, that would grant him intimate and entirely unsupervised knowledge of the private lives of every man who had signed his father's ruin with their own careless hands. For 9 long years he served diligently and without complaint, said little to anyone, gave offence to none, and waited, I believe, gentlemen, quite literally waited, accumulating across those patient years a precise and exhaustive understanding of the daily habits, the health, the small unguarded hours of Silas Renfield, Josiah Pratt, Increase Hobbs, and the long-dead Cornelius Stoke, whom fate alone had placed beyond his terrible reach. "But why the disc, Mr. Holmes?" asked Lestrade, who had listened to this entire recitation with the close attention of a man determined to understand every particular for his eventual report. "Why announce the murder at all, when simple silence would surely have served his purpose so very much better and so much more safely? Because, Inspector, our Mr. Hartwell did not regard himself, in his own private reckoning, as a murderer in any vulgar or common sense of that word. He regarded himself, rather, as an instrument of accounts long overdue for settlement, and an account, properly and honourably kept, according to his own strict private code, must be openly declared before it is finally settled in full. The engraved prophecy was not mere boastfulness on his part, nor was it merely theatre staged for our benefit, though it served very effectively indeed both to terrify and to misdirect our early suspicions toward poor Mr. Vane. It was, in his own carefully ordered mind, a form of formal notice, a debtor's summons, if you will permit the comparison, served upon men who he believed had escaped, for 20 long years, any reckoning whatever for his father's needless death and his own ruined childhood. And the precise timing of the deaths, I said slowly, the whole pattern at last falling into place before me, was never truly a mystery to be unravelled at all. It was simply a debt being paid on its appointed schedule, said Holmes, finishing my thought with evident satisfaction, by a man raised quite literally from the age of 13 among the instruments of measured and exacting time, who had concluded, in the long and bitter solitude of his grief, that the only justice now available to him must be administered with the same unyielding precision his father's honest trade had taught him, indirectly, to value above all other things in this world. He is no madman, gentlemen, whatever the popular press will doubtless make of him. He is, in his own tragic and disciplined fashion, the most controlled man I have encountered in 20 years of this curious practice, and discipline turned wholly and irrevocably toward vengeance is, I think, very nearly the most dangerous force this world contains. Hartwell, who had listened to this entire recitation without the smallest change in his calm expression, inclined his head slightly when Holmes had finished speaking. "You have set it down more clearly and more fairly than I could ever have managed myself, Mr. Holmes," he said quietly into the silence that followed. "I have only this small matter to add, for the sake of whatever record the courts will keep of this affair. I do not ask for mercy, and I confess I do not regret what I have done, whatever the law must now do with me in consequence. I regret only that the law itself was too slow, and too readily forgiving of its own comfortable gentlemen, to spare me the terrible necessity of doing what I have done with my own 2 hands. Chapter 15. The Clockmaker's Son. The trial of Thomas Hartwell, when it came at last some months later in the new year, drew considerable public attention throughout the city, not least because the revelation of the Severn Valley Ship Canal fraud. For fraud it was ultimately proven beyond doubt to have been, the company's failure concealed for years by exactly the sort of comfortable and convenient silence among gentlemen that Helena Quill's own private inquiry had first begun to disturb, brought a measure of long-delayed disgrace upon the memory of Silas Renfield and considerable public embarrassment to the surviving Dr. Hobbs, who found himself, in the slow wake of the trial's revelations, quietly and permanently eased from every position of dignity and trust he had previously held within the guild and beyond it. Hartwell himself offered no defence at trial beyond the plain truth as Holmes had laid it out before us that final night, and was condemned in due course by the jury, though I am told, and Holmes confirmed it to me afterward with a quiet satisfaction he did not trouble greatly to disguise from me, that considerable public sympathy attached itself to the case as the full facts emerged in the newspapers. Sufficient sympathy indeed that the sentence was in due course commuted to penal transportation rather than the gallows, a mercy I have since come to believe Holmes himself had quietly and persistently worked, through channels he never fully disclosed even to me, to help secure on the prisoner's behalf. "He killed 2 men, Watson, in cold and deliberate blood," Holmes said to me one evening, some weeks after the trial had finally concluded, when I remarked upon this evident softness of feeling in a matter where his usual professed creed was the strict and entirely impartial pursuit of justice, without favour or exception. But the law itself killed his father a generation ago, in every meaningful sense but the merely literal one, and never once troubled to acknowledge that earlier and more fundamental debt. I do not excuse him, Watson, nor would I ever ask you to. I merely decline to pretend, for the comfort of polite society, that the scales of justice were ever truly balanced before he himself attempted, in his own terrible and patient fashion, to balance them with his own hands. Helena Quill, for her own part, used a generous portion of her considerable inheritance, against the earnest advice of her solicitors, and entirely to her credit, in my own settled estimation of her character, to establish a private fund for the relief of those families ruined long ago by the old canal fraud, including, I am glad to record here, a modest but respectable pension settled upon a distant cousin of Walter Hartwell's, the only surviving relative the unhappy clockmaker's son had ever possessed in all the world. She continued her late uncle's workshop thereafter, with conspicuous and well-deserved success, and I am told it remains, to this very day, among the most respected horological establishments in all of Clerkenwell, its reputation entirely undiminished by the dark history that had briefly clouded its name. There is a curious symmetry in it all, Watson, when one stops to consider the whole pattern, Holmes observed, some weeks after the trial had fully concluded, as we sat one quiet evening over our pipes in the familiar and comfortable disorder of our Baker Street rooms. A clockmaker's fortune, built in part upon a fraud that ruined another clockmaker's family entirely, restored at last by the dead man's own niece to the relief of that very same family's distant remnant. Time, it would seem, keeps its own private accounts in this world, quite independent of any ledger a mortal hand may engrave in brass, however carefully and patiently composed. You believe in such symmetry, then, Holmes? In some manner of cosmic or providential justice working itself out beneath the surface of these events? I believe in nothing so grand or so comforting as that, my dear fellow, said Holmes with a faint, dry smile that flickered and was gone. I believe only that men's actions carry consequences which outlive the men themselves by many years, and that those consequences have a tiresome and persistent habit of returning, sooner or later, to settle their own accounts in full. Usually, I am sorry to observe from long experience, upon parties who had no direct hand whatever in the original transaction that set the whole chain in motion. It is not justice, properly speaking, Watson. It is merely arithmetic, conducted with patience across rather longer intervals of time than we are generally accustomed to observing in the ordinary, hurried course of our own short lives. Chapter 16. A quiet hour at Baker Street. It was some weeks later still, on a mild and unexpectedly gentle evening in early spring, the worst of the winter's fog finally lifted from the city at last, that I found Holmes seated by our window with the engraved brass disc, the very first that had started the whole strange affair, retained with Lestrade's somewhat reluctant official permission as a private memento of the case, turning slowly and thoughtfully between his long fingers as the last light of day failed gently over the familiar rooftops of Marylebone. A curious case, Watson, in retrospect, now that the dust of it has properly settled, he said, without looking up from the small disc in his hand, not for any great or unusual cleverness in its eventual solution, which depended in the end upon nothing more remarkable than ordinary patience and a steady willingness to verify what others had merely and conveniently assumed to be true, but for what it revealed, rather more disturbingly, of the uses to which a truly disciplined mind may ultimately be put, for good or for very great and terrible ill alike. Hartwell might, under other and kinder circumstances, have made an excellent detective himself, Watson, given the chance that life never once offered him. He possessed every quality the work properly requires, patience beyond the ordinary measure, precision in every particular, an absolute and admirable refusal to mistake the merely convenient explanation for the difficult and uncomfortable truth. It is a melancholy thought indeed that the very faculties which might so easily have served the cause of justice were instead turned, by 20 years of grief and neglect, toward its private and terrible imitation. You sound almost as though you pity him, Holmes, despite everything he has done. I pity the boy in the workhouse, Watson, far more than I find myself able to condemn the man he subsequently became, though I do not for one moment pretend that the distinction excuses what inevitably followed from it. We are none of us, I think, so very far removed in our own characters from the men we might so easily have become, Had fortune dealt us a rather different hand of cards at the very outset of our lives? It is a sobering thought, and not one I generally care to dwell upon longer than simple honesty requires of me. He set the small disc down at last upon the mantelpiece, beside the worn Persian slipper in which he habitually kept his tobacco, and reached instead, with evident relief, for his violin. "Will you not give me the satisfaction, at the very least, of admitting plainly that the case interested you a great deal more than you generally care to confess?" "It interested me," Holmes admitted, drawing the bow slowly across the strings in a long, contemplative phrase that might have been Paganini in one of his more melancholy moods, or might equally have been some private and melancholy invention entirely of Holmes's own devising. "Rather more than I should perhaps care to confess in print, Watson, should you ever in future take it into your head to set this particular little history down for eventual publication in your usual fashion. But I find, on the whole, and taking the matter in its entirety, that I have had quite enough of clocks and their ceaseless, indifferent ticking for one season at least. There is something in their relentless and entirely unforgiving progress that I confess unsettles me rather more than any ordinary murderer I have yet had occasion to pursue in the whole course of my career. For a murderer, however clever or however dangerous, may eventually be caught and stopped, and in some fashion reasoned with after his own lights. Time alone, Watson, never once pauses in its course to hear any man's case, however just or however urgent his appeal. Outside our familiar window, the lamplighters were beginning their slow and methodical evening rounds along the length of Baker Street, small points of gold kindling one by one against the deepening blue of the gathering evening, and somewhere below us, faint through the glass, I caught the distant chime of a church clock striking the half-hour with its usual patient indifference, measuring out, that day exactly as on every day before it, the whole vast and ticking city's small and desperate human dramas, without the smallest concern for their outcome. Holmes set down his bow at last, glanced toward our own mantel clock with something very near to wry irony in his sharp grey eyes, and reached instead, with evident and considerable satisfaction, for his pipe and his tobacco. "Come, Watson," said he, settling back into his chair with the air of a man whose work, for the present at least, was fully and satisfactorily concluded. "I believe it is very nearly time for our supper, and for once in the whole course of this singular and troubling affair, I find I have not the smallest objection in the world to keeping so modest and so welcome an appointment."